Echoes of African Heroes, Episode 9, Ahmed Sékou Touré. Chapter 1, The Birth of a Defiant Voice. Welcome to Echoes of African Heroes, the channel where the voices of Africa's greatest leaders, warriors, and visionaries echo across generations. Across the long history of Africa, there have been moments when a single voice changed the direction of an entire nation. Moments when a leader stood before power and refused to bow. Moments when the courage of one individual awakened the courage of millions. This is the story of one of those voices, the voice of Ahmed Sékou Touré, the man who would one day stand before the French Empire and say something few colonial leaders had ever dared to say: no. But before he became a revolutionary leader, before he became the first president of an independent Guinea, before his words echoed across the African continent, Ahmed Sékou Touré was simply a boy growing up in a land shaped by empire. The year was 1922. The place was Farana, a small town in the interior of what the world then called French Guinea. At the time, Guinea was not an independent country. It was part of the vast network of territories controlled by the French colonial empire, an empire that stretched across continents, from Europe to Africa, from Asia to the Caribbean. French colonial rule had reshaped the political landscape of West Africa. Traditional kingdoms had been conquered. Local authority had been replaced by colonial administrators. And decisions about the future of African societies were made thousands of miles away in Paris. For many people living under colonial rule, daily life meant navigating a system designed to benefit the empire. African farmers produced crops that were exported to Europe. African workers labored under colonial regulations. African communities were expected to accept a political order they had never chosen. Yet even within this system of control, traditions endured. Languages survived, cultures adapted, and the memory of resistance remained alive. In the household where Ahmed Sékou Touré was born, those memories were particularly powerful, because his family carried a legacy that was already woven into the history of West African resistance. Ahmed Sékou Touré was the great-grandson of Samori Touré, one of the most formidable African leaders to ever challenge European colonial expansion. Decades earlier, Samori Touré had built a powerful empire across parts of present-day Guinea, Mali, and Ivory Coast. For nearly 20 years, he resisted the advance of French colonial forces, organizing armies, leading campaigns, defending his territory against an empire determined to expand. The struggle had been long and brutal. Eventually, Samori Touré was captured by French forces and exiled. But his resistance left a powerful legacy, a reminder that colonial conquest had never been accepted quietly. For young Ahmed Sékou Touré, that legacy was more than history. It was part of his identity, a reminder that leadership sometimes requires defiance. Growing up in Farana, he experienced life in a society where colonial authority existed alongside deeply rooted African traditions. Village life was shaped by community, by elders who shared stories of the past, by families who passed down cultural values from generation to generation. These early experiences helped shape the worldview of the young boy who would one day challenge an empire. But his path to leadership would not follow the traditional route of colonial elites. Unlike some future African leaders who received advanced education in European universities, Sékou Touré's formal schooling was limited. He attended local schools where the colonial education system emphasized obedience and loyalty to France. Yet the young Toure was known for something that would define him throughout his life: a refusal to remain silent. Teachers sometimes described him as stubborn, others described him as determined. But even as a young student, he showed a willingness to question authority. Eventually, his time in formal education came to an abrupt end. He was expelled from school, an event that might have discouraged many young people. But for Sékou Touré, it became a turning point. Because the education that would shape his future would not come from textbooks. It would come from experience, from observing the inequalities of colonial society, from listening to the frustrations of workers, from understanding the struggles of ordinary people living under colonial rule. These lessons would prove far more powerful than anything he might have learned in a classroom. As he grew older, Sékou Touré began working in the colonial economy. One of his early jobs was with the postal service. At first glance, it may have seemed like an ordinary position: sorting letters, handling communication between towns. But the postal service provided something unexpected. It exposed him to networks of workers across the territory, people who shared similar frustrations, people who began asking similar questions. Why were African workers paid less than Europeans? Why were decisions about their lives made by distant administrators? Why did colonial rule seem permanent? These questions would lead Sékou Touré toward a movement that was beginning to reshape political life across Africa: the labor movement. Trade unions were becoming powerful organizations. They brought workers together. They allowed people to speak collectively. And in many cases, they became the training ground for future political leaders. For Sékou Touré, the labor movement offered something important: a platform, a way to challenge injustice, a way to organize people who had long been excluded from political power. The boy who had once been expelled from school was beginning a journey that would transform him into one of the most influential political figures in West Africa. But neither he nor the people around him could yet see how far that journey would go. They could not yet see the moment when he would stand before the French Empire and demand independence. They could not yet see the words that would echo across the continent. Those words were still years away, but the foundations of that moment were already being built. In the towns and villages of Guinea, in the struggles of workers, in the determination of a young man who believed that dignity was not something granted by an empire, it was something claimed by a people. And the voice that would soon challenge colonial power was only beginning to rise. The story of Ahmed Sékou Touré was just beginning. Chapter 2: The Awakening of a Revolutionary. The young Ahmed Sékou Touré was growing up in a world defined by contradictions. On the surface, French colonial authorities presented their rule as a civilizing mission. They spoke of progress, of modernization, of bringing order to the territories they controlled. But for the people living under colonial rule, reality often looked very different. In towns and villages across Guinea, Africans saw how power truly operated. European administrators held the highest positions. European merchants controlled major trade. European settlers enjoyed privileges unavailable to the African population. African workers performed much of the labor that sustained the colonial economy. They harvested crops. They transported goods. They maintained infrastructure that connected the colony to global markets. Yet despite their central role in the economy, these workers rarely enjoyed the benefits of the wealth they helped create. Wages were low, opportunities were limited, and political power remained firmly in the hands of colonial authorities. As Sékou Touré grew older, he began to see these inequalities more clearly. Every job he held revealed another layer of the system. Every conversation with fellow workers exposed shared frustrations. One of the most influential experiences of his early adulthood came during his work in the postal service. The colonial postal system connected towns across the territory. Letters traveled between villages. Official messages moved between administrative centers. And through this network, Sékou Touré encountered people from many different communities. Postal workers were among the few Africans whose jobs required communication across large regions. They exchanged information. They shared stories of conditions in different towns. And they compared the treatment of workers under colonial authority. It did not take long for many of them to realize something important. The problems they faced were not isolated. Workers in one town experienced the same struggles as workers in another. Low wages, long hours, limited rights. This realization began to inspire a new idea. If workers were experiencing the same injustices, perhaps they could unite to demand change. Across the French colonial territories in West Africa, labor movements were beginning to emerge. Trade unions offered workers a collective voice. They allowed people to organize strikes, to negotiate with employers, to challenge unfair practices. For many colonial administrators, these unions were troubling developments. They feared organized workers might become politically active, and in some cases, their fears were justified. Because labor movements often became the foundation of broader political resistance. Sékou Touré quickly recognized the power of organization. He saw that when workers spoke individually, they were easily ignored. But when they spoke together, their voices became impossible to dismiss. In the late 1940s, he became actively involved in union activities. His natural leadership abilities quickly became apparent. He was a powerful speaker, confident, passionate, and deeply committed to the cause of workers' rights. At meetings and gatherings, he spoke about dignity, about fairness, about the need for Africans to stand together in pursuit of justice. These speeches began attracting attention. Workers respected his courage. They admired his willingness to confront colonial authorities. And they recognized something rare in his leadership: authenticity. Sékou Touré did not speak as a distant political figure. He spoke as someone who understood their struggles firsthand, someone who had experienced the same working conditions, someone who believed deeply that change was possible. Soon he rose within the ranks of the labor movement. He became a leading figure in the Postal Workers' Union, and eventually, he helped organize broader coalitions of workers across Guinea. Strikes became one of the most powerful tools available to these unions. When workers refused to perform their duties, colonial administrators were forced to pay attention. Because the economy depended on labor, and without that labor, the colonial system could not function. Organizing strikes required courage. Colonial authorities often responded harshly. Workers who participated risked losing their jobs. Some faced arrest. Others were threatened with punishment. Yet the strikes continued, because the workers believed they were fighting for something essential: respect, dignity, a voice in determining their future. During this period, Sékou Touré's reputation continued to grow. He became known not only as a union organizer, but also as a political thinker, someone who understood the broader implications of the struggle. He began speaking about more than wages and working conditions. He began speaking about independence. The idea of independence was spreading across Africa. In neighboring territories, leaders were beginning to challenge colonial rule. Across the continent, people were asking new questions. Why should foreign powers govern African societies? Why should resources be controlled by distant capitals? Why should Africans remain subjects rather than citizens? For Sékou Touré, these questions were deeply personal. His family history had already shown him the cost of resisting empire. His great-grandfather, Samori Touré, had fought colonial expansion with weapons. Now a new generation was beginning to challenge colonial rule with political organization. Trade unions became the training ground for these political movements. Through organizing workers, leaders learned how to mobilize large groups of people. They learned how to communicate ideas. They learned how to confront authority. Sékou Touré was mastering all of these skills, and with each passing year, his influence continued to expand. Workers trusted him, communities respected him, and colonial officials began to view him with increasing concern. Because the young union organizer was becoming something more, something potentially dangerous to the colonial system, a national leader. The awakening of Ahmed Sékou Touré had begun. The worker who had once sorted letters in a colonial postal office was now helping organize a political awakening across Guinea. But the moment that would define his place in history was still ahead. A moment when the future of Guinea would hang in the balance. A moment when a choice would be presented to the people: remain under the influence of empire, or step into the uncertain path of independence. When that moment arrived, Ahmed Sékou Touré would be ready to answer. And the answer he would give would echo across Africa. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Trade. By the early 1950s, something powerful was beginning to take shape across French West Africa. A quiet revolution, not led by armies, not fought with rifles, but organized through workers. Across colonial territories, African laborers were beginning to realize that their collective strength could challenge the authority of empire. They were the backbone of the colonial economy. They harvested crops. They transported goods. They worked the railways, the ports, and the administrative systems that kept the colonial machine running. And if those workers stopped working, the system itself would begin to tremble. In Guinea, one of the most influential voices in this movement was Ahmed Sékou Touré, the young union organizer who had once sorted letters in a colonial postal office, had now become a powerful figure in the labor movement. Workers listened when he spoke, because he spoke with clarity, with conviction, and with a deep understanding of their daily struggles. Sékou Touré believed that dignity was not something colonial authorities would simply grant. It had to be demanded. He helped organize strikes among postal workers and other labor groups. Meetings were held in modest halls. in open courtyards, sometimes beneath the shade of large trees where workers gathered to discuss their grievances. These meetings were more than political events. They were moments of awakening. Workers who had once believed their struggles were individual began to realize they were part of a larger movement. During these gatherings, Sékou Touré often spoke about unity, about the importance of standing together, about the idea that colonial power could not easily ignore the voice of an organized people. His speeches were direct, sometimes fiery, but always grounded in the everyday experiences of the workers he represented. He spoke about wages, about working conditions, about respect. But beneath those practical concerns was a deeper message. A message that slowly began to transform the labor movement into something much larger. A political awakening. Because as workers organized themselves to demand better treatment, they began asking deeper questions. Why should foreign administrators decide the fate of their country? Why should Guinea remain under colonial rule? Why should Africans accept a system that denied them political power? These questions did not emerge overnight. They grew slowly through years of organizing, through conversations between workers, through shared frustrations, and through leaders like Sékou Touré, who helped articulate the possibilities of change. Colonial authorities watched these developments with growing concern. Trade unions had initially been tolerated as organizations focused on economic issues. But when labor movements began connecting their demands to political independence, colonial officials became uneasy. In response, the colonial administration attempted to limit the influence of union leaders. Some organizers were monitored, others were pressured. But Sékou Touré remained undeterred. His confidence continued growing as he witnessed the power of collective action. Strikes forced negotiations. Worker protests attracted attention across the territory. And the idea of political representation gained momentum. Soon, Sékou Touré expanded his influence beyond the postal workers. He became a key figure within the broader trade union movement across French West Africa. Through alliances with labor organizations in neighboring territories, he helped coordinate regional efforts to improve workers' rights. These networks also allowed activists to share ideas about democracy, about sovereignty, about the future of Africa beyond colonial rule. The labor movement was becoming a school for political leadership. Many of the skills required to organize workers were the same skills needed to lead a national movement: communication, strategy, mobilization. Sékou Touré excelled at all of them. His speeches became more confident, his influence more visible, and his reputation as a leader continued to grow. By the mid-1950s, he had become one of the most recognizable political figures in Guinea. Workers trusted him, communities respected him, and even colonial administrators understood that he was becoming a powerful force within the territory. Yet despite his growing influence, Sékou Touré remained focused on a simple principle: dignity. He believed that Africans deserved the same rights and opportunities as any other people. This belief resonated deeply with many Guineans, because it reflected a truth that had long been suppressed by colonial ideology: the idea that African societies could govern themselves. As the decade progressed, Political changes were unfolding across the world. European empires were weakening after World War II. Independence movements were spreading throughout Asia and Africa. In neighboring Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah was mobilizing the masses in a campaign for self-rule. Across North Africa, resistance movements challenged French and British authority. These events reinforced the growing belief that colonial rule was not permanent, that the future might hold something different, something independent. In Guinea, Sékou Touré began translating that hope into political action. He became involved with the Democratic Party of Guinea, a political movement aligned with broader anti-colonial networks across French West Africa. Through this party, he helped organize political campaigns, public meetings, and rallies where thousands gathered to hear speeches about the future of their country. At these gatherings, Sékou Touré spoke with increasing confidence about independence, not as a distant dream, but as a real possibility. And as his message spread, more people began to believe that the colonial order might one day be replaced by something new, a nation governed by its own citizens, a nation free to determine its own destiny. The rise of Ahmed Sékou Touré as a trade union leader had transformed him into something far greater. He was no longer simply an advocate for workers. He had become a symbol of political awakening. Yet the most dramatic chapter of his story had not yet begun, because within a few years, the French government would present its colonies with a choice that would determine the future of Guinea. Remain within the French colonial system, or step boldly into independence. When that moment arrived, Ahmed Sékou Touré would face the most important decision of his life, and the words he would speak would change the course of African history forever. Chapter 4: A Continent Awakens. By the mid-1950s, the winds of change were sweeping across the African continent. What had once seemed impossible only decades earlier was now becoming a reality. Colonial empires, once believed to be permanent, were beginning to weaken. The world that emerged after the Second World War looked very different from the one that had existed before it. European powers had been exhausted by years of global conflict. Their economies were strained. Their political influence had begun to shift. And across Asia and Africa, colonial subjects were beginning to question a system that had governed their lives for generations. Across the continent, a powerful idea was spreading, an idea that would reshape the future of Africa: self-determination. For centuries, European empires insisted that Africa was not ready to govern itself. Colonial administrators repeated the same argument. Independence, they said, was a distant dream, something that might come someday, but not yet. But a new generation of African leaders refused to accept that narrative. They believed Africans were fully capable of shaping their own destiny, and they were determined to prove it. One of the most powerful voices in this movement was Kwame Nkrumah. In the Gold Coast, the country that would soon become Ghana, Nkrumah mobilized an extraordinary political awakening. He spoke of unity, he spoke of freedom, and he spoke of Africa's right to govern itself. His message spread far beyond Ghana, because it was never only about one nation. It was about the future of an entire continent. In 1957, Ghana achieved independence from British colonial rule. It became the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from European control in the modern era. The moment sent shockwaves through the colonial world. For millions of Africans living under colonial rule, Ghana's independence was proof that change was possible. What had once seemed like a distant dream suddenly felt within reach. If the Gold Coast could become Ghana, perhaps Guinea could become independent as well. Ahmed Sékou Touré watched these developments with deep interest. As a leader in Guinea's labor movement and an increasingly influential political figure, he understood the significance of what was happening. The colonial system was beginning to crack. Across French West Africa, political movements were gaining momentum. New parties were forming. Workers were organizing. Communities were demanding representation in the decisions that affected their lives. French colonial authorities could no longer ignore these pressures. They understood that maintaining absolute control over their African territories was becoming increasingly difficult. And so they began considering new political arrangements. In Paris, French leaders debated how to manage the growing demand for autonomy among their colonies. Some believed reforms could preserve the empire in a modified form. Others feared that independence movements might spread uncontrollably. One of the most significant political figures involved in these discussions was French President Charles de Gaulle. In 1958, de Gaulle proposed a major restructuring of the French colonial system. Instead of direct colonial rule, France would create a new political framework known as the French Community. Under this arrangement, colonies would gain limited autonomy while remaining closely tied to France. They would manage some of their internal affairs, but France would still maintain influence over defense, foreign policy, and economic relationships. For many colonial leaders, the proposal appeared to offer a compromise, a gradual transition, a way to avoid the uncertainties of full independence. But for others, the proposal raised a deeper question. Was autonomy enough? Or was true independence the only path to dignity? In Guinea, the debate quickly intensified. Political leaders, labor organizers, and community representatives began discussing the implications of France's proposal. Should Guinea remain connected to France through the new French community? Or should it pursue complete independence? For Ahmed Sékou Touré, the answer was becoming increasingly clear. Years of organizing workers had taught him an important lesson. True dignity could not exist within a system that ultimately placed power in the hands of an external authority. Autonomy might bring certain improvements, but it would not fundamentally change the relationship between colony and empire. Guinea would still be dependent, still constrained, still influenced by decisions made outside its borders. Sékou Touré believed his country deserved more. He believed that Guinea should stand as a fully independent nation, a country capable of shaping its own future. Yet advocating for independence was not without risks. The economic relationship between Guinea and France was deeply intertwined. French companies controlled many industries. French administrators managed key infrastructure. French financial systems supported much of the colony's economy. Breaking away from that system could have serious consequences: economic disruption, political instability, uncertain international support. Some political leaders worried that independence might come too quickly. They feared that Guinea might struggle without French assistance. And so the debate continued. But across towns and villages, a growing number of ordinary Guineans were beginning to embrace the idea of freedom. They had seen Ghana achieve independence. They had heard the speeches of African leaders calling for sovereignty. And they had experienced decades of colonial inequality. The desire for change was growing stronger, and Ahmed Sékou Touré stood at the center of that transformation. Through speeches, meetings, and political organizing, he continued to build support for a bold vision. A vision in which Guinea would no longer be defined by colonial authority, but by its own people. As the year 1958 approached, the French government prepared to present its colonies with a historic choice. Each territory would vote in a referendum. They could accept membership in the French community or reject it and pursue immediate independence. The decision would shape the future of millions. And in Guinea, the stakes could not have been higher. For Ahmed Sékou Touré, the referendum represented something far greater than a political procedure. It was a test of courage, a moment when a nation would decide whether it was ready to stand on its own. The coming months would determine whether Guinea would remain tied to the French Empire or become one of the first nations in French Africa to claim complete independence. And when the moment arrived, Sékou Touré would deliver words that would echo across the continent, words that would challenge the very foundation of colonial rule. But before those words were spoken, the people of Guinea would have to make their choice. And history was watching. Chapter 5. The Referendum of 1958. The year was 1958. Across French Africa, the future of millions of people was about to be decided. For decades, the French colonial empire had maintained tight control over its territories. Decisions about governance, trade, and diplomacy were made in Paris. African leaders had limited influence, and independence had always seemed like a distant possibility. But the world was changing. Colonial empires were weakening, nationalist movements were gaining strength, and France could no longer ignore the growing demand for political reform. To address these pressures, French President Charles de Gaulle introduced a bold proposal, a new political framework called the French Community. Under this arrangement, French colonies would gain a degree of autonomy. They would manage many of their internal affairs, but they would remain closely tied to France in matters of defense, foreign policy, and economic cooperation. For many colonial administrators, the proposal appeared to be a practical solution. It allowed France to maintain influence while acknowledging the political awakening taking place across Africa. But for the people of the colonies, the proposal raised an important question. Was autonomy enough? Or should they demand complete independence? To determine the answer, France announced that a referendum would be held across its African territories. Each colony would vote. They could either accept membership in the French community or reject it and pursue immediate independence. The choice was not an easy one. Remaining within the French community offered stability, economic support, and continued access to French institutions. Rejecting the proposal, however, carried enormous risks. It meant cutting ties with the colonial administration. It meant losing financial assistance. And it meant stepping into an uncertain future without the support of France. Across French Africa, many leaders hesitated. They feared that independence might come too quickly. They worried about economic consequences. And some believed gradual reform was the safer path. But in Guinea, the political atmosphere was different. because one leader had already begun preparing his country for a bold decision. Ahmed Sékou Touré. As the leader of the Democratic Party of Guinea and a prominent figure in the labor movement, Sékou Touré had spent years building a powerful political network. Workers supported him. Young activists admired him. And communities across the country were listening to his message. He believed that the time had come for Guinea to claim its full sovereignty, not partial autonomy, not limited reform, but independence. In August of 1958, French President Charles de Gaulle began touring the colonies to promote his new political proposal. He traveled across Africa, encouraging colonial leaders to support membership in the French community. When he arrived in Guinea, the atmosphere was tense. Crowds gathered. Political leaders prepared their statements, and many wondered how the Guinean leadership would respond. During one of the most significant meetings of the tour, Ahmed Sékou Touré stood before the French president and delivered a speech that would become legendary. His words were calm, but their message was unmistakable. He acknowledged the long relationship between Guinea and France. He spoke about the contributions of the Guinean people. But he also made something very clear. Guinea would not sacrifice its dignity for convenience. Then he delivered the sentence that would echo across the continent. We prefer poverty in freedom to riches in slavery. The statement stunned many observers. Few colonial leaders had ever spoken so directly to the representatives of empire. It was a declaration not only of political intent, but of national identity. For Sékou Touré, the issue was simple. Freedom was not negotiable. Independence was not something that should be postponed indefinitely. And Guinea had the right to determine its own future. Across the country, his words spread quickly. Workers repeated them. Students discussed them. Families debated what the coming referendum would mean. For many Guineans, the speech inspired pride. It confirmed that their leaders were willing to stand firm in defense of national dignity. But it also intensified the pressure surrounding the referendum, because the choice now felt even more significant. Remain tied to France, or follow the path that Sékou Touré had boldly outlined. Colonial officials hoped that fear of economic consequences would persuade voters to support membership in the French community. They warned of instability, of financial hardship, of the challenges that might follow independence. Yet the message of dignity continued to resonate. Across Guinea, political rallies attracted large crowds. Speeches emphasized the importance of self-determination. Activists encouraged citizens to vote for independence. For the first time in the history of the colony, ordinary people felt that their decision might shape the destiny of their nation. The referendum was not merely a political procedure. It was a moment of collective choice. On September 28, 1958, the people of Guinea went to the polls. Men and women from towns and villages across the country cast their votes. When the results were finally announced, the outcome was unmistakable. Guinea had rejected membership in the French community. The people had chosen independence. The decision sent shockwaves through the colonial world. Because Guinea had done something no other French African colony had dared to do, it had said no. But the consequences of that decision would soon become clear. France responded quickly, and the path to independence would prove far more difficult than many had imagined. Yet despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, one truth could no longer be denied. Guinea had chosen freedom, and Ahmed Sékou Touré had become the voice of a nation determined to stand on its own. Chapter 6. The words that shocked an empire. The results of the referendum in Guinea did not take long to travel across the world. Within hours, news agencies began reporting the outcome. Guinea had rejected the French community. The colony had voted for independence. For many observers, the decision was astonishing. Until that moment, most colonial leaders in French Africa had chosen caution. They preferred gradual reform. They hoped to maintain economic ties with France while slowly gaining more political authority. But Guinea had chosen a different path. It had chosen freedom, immediate, uncompromising. And at the center of that historic decision stood Ahmed Sékou Touré, the trade union leader who had transformed himself into the voice of a nation. His declaration, "We prefer poverty in freedom to riches in slavery," quickly spread across Africa. It appeared in newspapers. It was discussed in political meetings. It became a symbol of defiance against colonial domination. But within the halls of the French government, the reaction was far less celebratory. Many officials were deeply angered by Guinea's decision. From their perspective, Sékou Touré had publicly rejected the authority of France. He had challenged the political order of the empire. And France was determined to demonstrate that such defiance would come with consequences. Almost immediately, French authorities began preparing their withdrawal from Guinea. Civil servants packed their belongings. Military personnel prepared to leave their posts. Technical experts who had been working in government departments made plans to return to France. Within weeks, the colonial administration that had governed Guinea for decades began disappearing. Offices were emptied. Administrative records were removed. Equipment was taken away. The withdrawal was swift, and in some cases, it was deliberately destructive. There were reports of French officials dismantling infrastructure before departing. Light bulbs were removed from government buildings. Vehicles were taken away. Supplies that had supported colonial administration vanished almost overnight. The message from France was unmistakable. If Guinea wanted independence, it would have to face the consequences alone. For the people of Guinea, the sudden departure of the colonial administration created enormous challenges. Entire government departments were left without experienced staff. Technical expertise disappeared. Financial support was abruptly cut off. Yet despite the uncertainty, many Guineans remained determined. Because the decision for independence had not been made lightly. It had been a statement of dignity, a declaration that their future would no longer be determined by an external power. Ahmed Sékou Touré understood the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Winning independence was only the first step. Now he had to help build an entirely new nation. Guinea needed institutions, administrative systems, economic strategies, diplomatic relationships with other countries. And all of this had to be created quickly, because the world was watching. Some international observers believed Guinea would struggle to survive without French support. Others predicted political instability. But Sékou Touré refused to allow those predictions to define his country's future. He began mobilizing the people of Guinea, encouraging them to take ownership of the nation they had chosen to create. Communities organized themselves to maintain essential services. Young professionals stepped forward to fill administrative roles. Teachers continued educating students despite the disruption. The process was difficult. There were shortages of resources, infrastructure problems, economic uncertainty. Yet the spirit of independence remained strong, because for many Guineans, freedom itself was worth the sacrifice. Meanwhile, the decision made in Guinea was sending powerful signals across the rest of Africa. Other colonial territories were observing closely. They were asking themselves a question. If Guinea could stand up to the French Empire, could they do the same? The courage of Sékou Touré had opened a door that others would soon walk through. Within a few years, many African nations would achieve independence. And the example set by Guinea would be remembered as one of the earliest acts of political defiance in French Africa. But independence also brought enormous responsibilities. As Guinea's first president, Sékou Touré now faced the difficult task of transforming a former colony into a functioning sovereign state. He would need to guide the country through economic challenges, navigate international politics during the Cold War, and maintain unity among diverse communities across the nation. The journey ahead would not be simple. History rarely grants easy victories, but the moment that had just taken place in 1958 had already secured Sékou Touré's place in the story of African liberation. Because he had done something few leaders had dared to do. He had stood before an empire and refused to compromise the dignity of his people. The words that shocked the French Empire were now part of Africa's political history, and their echo would continue inspiring independence movements across the continent. Yet the story of Ahmed Sékou Touré was far from over, because independence was only the beginning. The real challenge had just begun, and the future of Guinea now rested in the hands of the man who had dared to say no. October 2nd, 1958. It was a day that would forever be remembered in the history of Guinea. Across the country, people gathered in towns and villages to witness the birth of a new nation. Flags were raised, speeches were delivered, and for the first time in modern history, Guinea stood before the world as an independent state. The long era of colonial rule had ended. A new chapter had begun. At the center of this historic moment stood Ahmed Sékou Touré, the man whose courage had helped guide his country through one of the most decisive moments in its history. Now he would take on a new responsibility, the presidency of the Republic of Guinea. But independence did not arrive with a fully functioning government. It did not arrive with a ready-made system of administration, and it certainly did not arrive with economic security. The departure of the French administration had left enormous gaps in the country's infrastructure. Experienced civil servants were gone. Technical experts had returned to Europe. Financial support from France had been abruptly withdrawn. In many ways, Guinea had been left to build its future almost entirely from scratch. Yet the spirit of independence remained strong. Across the country, citizens understood that freedom required sacrifice, and they were prepared to make those sacrifices. President Sékou Touré quickly began organizing the foundations of the new state. Government ministries had to be established, administrative systems had to be rebuilt, and new leaders had to be trained to manage the country's institutions. young Guineans stepped forward to fill positions once occupied by colonial administrators. Teachers became policymakers. Students became civil servants. Community leaders became national officials. The process was challenging. Mistakes were inevitable. But there was also a powerful sense of national pride, because the people of Guinea were now shaping their own destiny. Internationally, the young republic began establishing diplomatic relationships with other countries. Guinea sought partnerships with nations willing to respect its independence. Some of these relationships developed with newly independent African states. Others formed with countries outside the traditional colonial sphere. The global political environment at the time was defined by the Cold War. Two powerful blocs, the United States and the Soviet Union, were competing for influence around the world. Many newly independent nations found themselves navigating a delicate balance between these global powers. Sékou Touré understood the importance of maintaining Guinea's sovereignty within this complex international landscape. He sought support where it could help strengthen the country's development. But he remained cautious about allowing external powers to dictate Guinea's policies. Domestically, the government began promoting a vision of national unity. Guinea was home to many ethnic communities and cultural traditions. Creating a cohesive national identity required careful leadership. Sékou Touré emphasized the idea that independence belonged to all Guineans, regardless of region, regardless of background, regardless of social status. His speeches often reminded citizens that independence was not the achievement of a single leader. It was the collective victory of an entire people. Economic development quickly became one of the government's most urgent priorities. Guinea possessed rich natural resources. Bauxite deposits, fertile agricultural land, and strategic coastal access offered significant opportunities. But transforming those resources into sustainable economic growth required infrastructure, investment, and skilled professionals. The government launched initiatives aimed at strengthening agriculture, expanding education, and developing industry. These efforts were not always easy. The sudden withdrawal of French technical support had created major obstacles. Yet the determination of the Guinean people remained remarkable. Communities organized local development projects. Farmers expanded production. Young people pursued education in the hope of contributing to their country's future. Beyond Guinea's borders, the country's bold choice for independence continued inspiring liberation movements across Africa. Leaders in other colonies closely studied the events of 1958. They saw that it was possible to challenge colonial authority. They saw that independence could be achieved through political mobilization. In many ways, Guinea had become a symbol of African self-determination. The first French African colony to reject the colonial framework outright. The first to declare that dignity mattered more than dependency. And the man who had articulated that message now carried the responsibility of guiding the young republic through its earliest years. Leadership during moments of national transformation is never simple. Expectations are high, challenges are immense, and history often judges such leaders with both admiration and scrutiny. Sékou Touré's presidency would eventually face its share of criticism and controversy. Political opposition would emerge. Economic difficulties would test the resilience of the nation. But in the early days of independence, what mattered most was the extraordinary achievement that had already taken place. Guinea had become free, and that freedom had been claimed through courage. For millions across Africa, the example of Guinea demonstrated something powerful. Colonial rule was not inevitable. Empires could be challenged, nations could rise. And the voice that had once echoed across a crowded rally, declaring that freedom was worth any sacrifice, continued to inspire those who believed in the future of a self-governing Africa. But the story of Ahmed Sékou Touré was not defined solely by the triumph of independence. The years that followed would reveal a far more complex legacy. A legacy shaped by ambition, political struggle, and the difficult realities of governing a young nation. To understand the full impact of his leadership, we must look beyond the moment of victory and examine the path that Guinea would follow in the years that came next. Chapter 8: Leadership, Power, and Controversy. The early years of Guinea's independence were filled with hope. Hope for economic development, hope for political stability, hope that the bold decision made in 1958 would lead to a prosperous future. But governing a newly independent nation is rarely simple. The challenges facing Guinea were enormous, and the responsibility for navigating those challenges rested largely on the shoulders of its first president, Ahmed Sékou Touré. For many Guineans, Touré was still the hero of independence, the leader who had stood before the French Empire and refused to compromise the dignity of his people. His courage had inspired a nation, and his leadership had helped guide Guinea through one of the most dramatic transitions in African history. Yet leadership after independence demanded more than courage. It required the ability to manage complex political realities, to balance competing interests, and to maintain stability in a country still finding its footing. In the early years of his presidency, Touré emphasized the importance of national unity. Guinea was home to many ethnic groups and regional identities. Creating a shared national vision required strong leadership. Touré believed that a unified political system was necessary to protect the fragile stability of the young republic. As a result, Guinea gradually moved toward a one-party political structure under the Democratic Party of Guinea. Supporters of this system argued that unity was essential during the early years of nation-building. They believed that political divisions could weaken the country during a critical period of development. But critics began raising concerns. Some feared that concentrating political power in a single party might limit democratic debate. Others worried that opposition voices were being pushed aside. Across the world, many newly independent nations faced similar dilemmas. Leaders struggled to balance the desire for national unity with the need for political openness. And the pressures of Cold War geopolitics added another layer of complexity. During the 1960s and 1970s, the world was divided between two major global powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each sought to expand its influence across newly independent regions, including Africa. Many African leaders were determined to avoid becoming pawns in this global rivalry. They sought to maintain independence from both sides. But navigating this political landscape was never easy. Touré pursued a path that emphasized Guinea's sovereignty and independence from external control. He established diplomatic relationships with a wide range of countries, including nations in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Socialist Bloc. These partnerships allowed Guinea to receive economic assistance and technical support. But they also placed the country within the broader dynamics of global political competition. Domestically, the government promoted policies aimed at strengthening national industries and reducing reliance on foreign economic control. Efforts were made to expand education, improve healthcare, and develop infrastructure across the country. Many of these initiatives reflected the broader goals of post-colonial development. African nations across the continent were working to build institutions capable of supporting independent economies and societies. Yet the process was difficult. Limited resources, administrative challenges, and political tensions often complicated these efforts. Over time, concerns about political repression began to emerge. Opposition figures accused the government of limiting dissent. Some critics were arrested, others fled into exile. Supporters of Toure argued that these measures were necessary to protect Guinea from destabilization. They pointed to the threats faced by many African governments during the Cold War, including attempted coups and external interference. Opponents, however, believed that political freedoms were being restricted. They argued that independence should include the right to open debate and political competition. These tensions contributed to a growing debate about Toure's leadership. Was he protecting the sovereignty of his nation during a dangerous period in world politics? Or was he consolidating too much power within the state? History often presents leaders with choices that are far from simple, and the judgments made about those choices can change over time. What remains clear is that Ahmed Sékou Touré played a central role in shaping Guinea's early decades as an independent nation. His decisions influenced the country's political institutions, its economic direction, and its position within the international community. For many Guineans, his leadership symbolized resistance to external domination. For others, it represented a period of political centralization that limited alternative voices. These differing perspectives are part of the complex legacy left by many revolutionary leaders. Because the qualities that enable someone to lead a liberation movement are not always the same qualities required to govern a nation peacefully over time. Yet regardless of these debates, one fact remains undeniable. Ahmed Sékou Touré changed the course of Guinea's history. His defiance of colonial authority had set a powerful example, and his decision to choose independence in 1958 had helped accelerate the broader wave of African liberation. The echoes of that moment continue to resonate far beyond Guinea's borders. Across Africa, nations were gaining independence, and the dream of self-determination was becoming reality for millions. But the story of Ahmed Sékou Touré would not end with the challenges of governance, because history ultimately remembers leaders not only for the controversies they face, but for the transformations they initiate. And in the case of Sékou Touré, the transformation of Guinea from colony to independent nation would remain one of the defining moments of Africa's 20th century. Yet to fully understand the significance of his life, we must also consider the legacy he left behind. A legacy that continues to shape how Guinea and Africa remembers the struggle for independence. Chapter 9: The Legacy of Independence. By the late 20th century, the story of Guinea's independence had already become part of African history. But the true significance of that moment extended far beyond the borders of the country itself. When Guinea voted for independence in 1958, It did more than create a new nation. It challenged the very foundations of colonial rule in French Africa. Until that moment, many colonial authorities believed that African territories would remain dependent on European power for many years to come. The idea that a colony would reject the French community outright seemed almost unimaginable. Yet Guinea had done exactly that, and in doing so, it demonstrated that political courage could reshape the future of an entire continent. Across Africa, independence movements took notice. Political leaders studying the events in Guinea saw that it was possible to challenge colonial authority directly. They saw that independence was not merely a distant aspiration, it was achievable. In the years that followed, a wave of liberation swept across Africa. Countries that had once been ruled by European empires began declaring their sovereignty. The map of the continent began to change. By the early 1960s, dozens of African nations had achieved independence. From Senegal to Nigeria, from Mali to Tanzania, from the Congo to Algeria. Each of these movements had its own unique history, but many shared a common inspiration: the belief that colonial rule could be confronted and overcome. Guinea's decision in 1958 had helped ignite that belief, and at the center of that moment stood Ahmed Sékou Touré. His declaration that freedom was worth more than economic security had resonated across Africa. It had become a symbol of dignity, a reminder that independence required courage. Touré also played an active role in the broader political networks that connected African leaders during the early years of independence. Many of these leaders believed that the future of the continent depended on cooperation between newly independent states. This vision was known as Pan-Africanism, the idea that African nations shared common historical experiences and common aspirations, that their strength would grow through unity. Pan-African leaders worked together to promote solidarity among African countries. They supported liberation movements in territories that were still under colonial rule, and they encouraged diplomatic cooperation among newly independent states. Guinea became one of the early centers of this political energy. Its government offered support to liberation movements across the continent, including struggles against colonial rule in Portuguese territories and southern Africa. For many activists, Guinea represented a beacon of independence, a country that had boldly rejected colonial compromise, a nation that believed African sovereignty should not be delayed. Touré himself maintained relationships with many prominent African leaders. These relationships reflected the shared challenges facing post-colonial governments: economic development, political stability, and the need to assert sovereignty within an international system still shaped by global power struggles. Despite the debates and controversies that surrounded his leadership, Touré's role in the independence era remained significant. Because the courage required to reject colonial authority in 1958 had set an example that others would follow. History often remembers such moments as turning points, moments when the choices of individuals intersect with the aspirations of entire societies, moments when the future shifts direction. Guinea's referendum was one of those moments, a moment when a nation chose uncertainty over dependency, freedom over comfort, dignity over compromise. For the people of Guinea, independence became a defining element of national identity, a reminder that their country had taken one of the earliest and boldest steps in the dismantling of colonial rule in French Africa. Over time, historians and scholars would examine the legacy of Sékou Touré from many different perspectives. Some focused on his role as a revolutionary leader who helped accelerate African independence. Others analyzed the political structures that developed during his presidency. These debates are part of the ongoing process through which societies reflect on their past. Because history is rarely simple. Leaders are rarely defined by a single moment. Yet the significance of Guinea's independence remains undeniable. The events of 1958 marked a turning point not only for one nation, but for an entire region of the world. When Sékou Touré declared that freedom was worth more than wealth without dignity, he articulated a principle that resonated far beyond the political debates of the time. It spoke to a universal human aspiration, the desire to determine one's own future. And that aspiration continues to shape the story of Africa today. Because the struggle for independence was never only about political borders. It was about identity, about sovereignty, about the right of African societies to define their own path. In that sense, the legacy of Ahmed Sékou Touré extends beyond Guinea. It belongs to the broader history of African liberation. Yet every story eventually reaches its final chapter. And the final chapter of Sékou Touré's life would arrive decades after the moment that had made him a symbol of independence. But even as time passed and the world changed, the words he spoke in 1958 continued to echo, a reminder that the courage to choose freedom can alter the course of history. And as we approach the conclusion of his story, we are reminded that the true measure of a leader is not only the challenges they face, but the legacy they leave behind. Chapter 10: The Echo That Still Lives. History often remembers leaders through the moments that define their courage, moments when decisions are made that shape the destiny of nations, moments when words spoken in defiance echo far beyond the walls where they were first heard. For Ahmed Sékou Touré, that defining moment came in 1958, when Guinea stood before the French Empire and chose independence, when a nation declared that dignity was worth more than comfort, when the voice of a people rose above the authority of colonial power. But the life of Sékou Touré extended far beyond that single moment. For more than 2 decades after independence, he remained at the center of Guinea's political life, guiding the country through a complex era marked by global tension, economic challenges, and the ongoing transformation of African societies. The world in which Guinea existed during those years was deeply shaped by the Cold War. 2 powerful blocs competed for influence across the globe, and newly independent nations often found themselves navigating difficult choices between competing alliances. Sékou Touré sought to preserve Guinea's sovereignty within this shifting international landscape. He maintained diplomatic relationships with a wide range of nations, at times cooperating with socialist countries, at other times engaging with Western partners. Like many leaders of newly independent states, he believed that political independence should be accompanied by economic independence. He argued that African nations must control their own resources, their own industries, their own future. Yet the path toward economic development proved difficult. Infrastructure remained limited. Global market pressures affected national economies, and many post-colonial governments struggled to balance ambition with available resources. Throughout these challenges, Guinea continued evolving as a nation. New generations grew up knowing only independence. Students attended schools built during the early years of the Republic. Young professionals entered public service. Communities participated in shaping the identity of a country still defining itself. For these generations, the events of 1958 were not simply history. They were part of a national story, a reminder that the country had taken a bold step toward sovereignty. Ahmed Sékou Touré remained president of Guinea for more than 25 years. During that time, his leadership inspired both admiration and debate. Supporters praised his role in defending national dignity and resisting external control. Critics raised concerns about political freedoms and governance. Such debates are common when societies reflect on the legacy of transformative leaders, because history rarely offers simple narratives. Leaders who guide nations through revolutionary change often leave legacies that are complex and deeply examined by future generations. What remains clear, however, is the profound significance of the decision made in 1958, the moment when Guinea became the first French colony in Africa to reject the framework of continued colonial influence. A moment that helped accelerate the wave of independence across the continent. By the early 1980s, the world had changed dramatically from the era in which Sékou Touré first rose to prominence. Africa was now composed largely of independent nations. The colonial empires that had once dominated the continent had largely disappeared. In 1984, after more than 2 decades as Guinea's leader, Ahmed Sékou Touré passed away. His death marked the end of an era that had begun with the courage of a trade union organizer who believed his country deserved freedom. Across Guinea, people reflected on the life of the man who had guided their nation through its earliest years of independence. For many, his name remained closely tied to one defining act of courage: the refusal to compromise national dignity. Today, the legacy of Ahmed Sékou Touré continues to be discussed by historians, scholars, and citizens alike. His leadership is studied as part of the broader story of Africa's 20th century liberation movements. And his famous declaration remains one of the most memorable statements of political independence ever spoken on the continent. We prefer poverty and freedom to riches in slavery. Those words captured something deeper than a political position. They captured the spirit of a generation determined to reclaim control over their destiny. Across Africa today, the echoes of the independence era still resonate. They can be heard in classrooms where students learn the history of liberation. They can be seen in the flags of nations that once existed under colonial rule, and they can be felt in the continuing effort to build societies defined by dignity, opportunity, and self-determination. Ahmed Sékou Touré was one of the voices that helped ignite that transformation. A voice that stood against empire. A voice that reminded the world that freedom is not granted by those who hold power. It is claimed by those who believe in their right to live with dignity. The story of his life is part of the larger story of Africa's awakening. A story of courage, of struggle, of transformation. And as long as that story continues to be told, the echo of Ahmed Sékou Touré's defiance will continue to inspire new generations. Because the voices of Africa's heroes do not fade with time. They travel across generations, across borders, across history itself. They remind us that the courage of one leader can awaken the courage of an entire people, and that the pursuit of freedom is one of humanity's most powerful forces. The echo continues. The next echo. The story of Ahmed Sékou Touré reminds us that the struggle for freedom is rarely born in a single moment. It is the result of generations. Generations of voices that refuse to accept injustice. Generations of people who believe that dignity is worth every sacrifice. When Guinea declared independence in 1958, it did more than create a new nation. It ignited a spark across Africa. A spark that helped accelerate the collapse of colonial rule. But the story of resistance in Guinea did not begin in the 20th century. Decades before Ahmed Sékou Touré stood before the French Empire, another Touré had already challenged its expansion. A warrior, a strategist, a leader who built one of the most powerful empires in West Africa. His name was Samori Touré. In the late 19th century, Samori Touré led a determined resistance against French colonial forces. For nearly 2 decades, he fought to defend the sovereignty of his people, organizing armies, building alliances, and refusing to surrender his land without a fight. His struggle would become one of the most legendary resistance movements in African history, and his legacy would shape the future of generations to come, including his great-grandson, Ahmed Sékou Touré. In our next episode of Echoes of African Heroes, we travel back to the 19th century, to the forests and savannas of West Africa, to explore the extraordinary story of Samori Touré, the man who defied empire long before the age of independence. If stories like this inspire you, subscribe to Echoes of African Heroes, like this video, and share it with others who believe Africa's history deserves to be told. Because the voices of Africa's greatest heroes still echo across generations. Their courage still inspires. Their legacy still shapes the future. This is Echoes of African Heroes, where the past speaks and the echoes never fade.